Up next, we touch upon the broader response to the latest APEC forum here in South Korea. For this, I have Professor Christophe Gaudin of Political Science at Kookmin University in the studio. Professor Gaudin, it's a pleasure to have you here.
For me too. Thanks for having me.
Right, Professor, this year's APEC Leaders Meeting ended with the adoption of the Gyeongju Declaration. If I were to ask you to summarize the gist of that declaration in one sentence, what would you say, and what is the relevance of this declaration?
Well, in one sentence, then, to cite the declaration directly, it emphasizes peace and coexistence. So what it means is that channels of communication are still open, which is a great thing. The declaration could be criticized, of course, because, for instance, it doesn't say anything concrete about the content of economic talks still to be had. But still, what I think to be most important is that after all of this turmoil that followed Trump's re-election, at least heads of state came to talk, and they came to some sort of agreement. So that's good news.
Keeping that in mind then, Professor Gaudin, what are your two perhaps main takeaways from this latest APEC forum here in South Korea?
Then the first achievement that was expected was some agreement to be reached between the US and China. And as we know, this has been covered. So the world economy is not to go on a standstill. So between both superpowers, for the moment, the air is relatively cleared, which is a good thing. So now, more generally, in the case of Korea, as a middle power like South Korea, whose main ally, the US, has become more unpredictable, the best Korea can do is to be able to ensure some sense of normalcy. As I put it before, it is important to keep all channels of communication open, and this was achieved too. So, I mean, of course, I do not want to cry for victory, but so far, so good. First achievement, China and America are back to the table. They have reached some kind of agreement. And second, you know, there is an African saying that says, when elephants dance, shrimps suffer. And so when these superpowers dance, other powers, middle powers like Korea or my home country, France, have everything to fear. So far, so good. Channels of communication are still open.
So out of a score out of 10, Professor Gaudin, how would you perhaps grade South Korea's hosting of this annual gathering?
It was perfect, 10 out of 10, but if I'm a bit cynical, the world was expecting no less. Because Korea has been hosting plenty of international meetings before, and the problem is that when you set the bar so high, people, I mean, any flow, any bump down the road will have been noticed immediately. So it was perfect, but honestly, in this case, failure was no option, especially when Korea needed, again, channels of communication to be reopened. This you cannot do in chaos. So it was perfect, but there was no other option, I'm afraid.
Right. Professor Gaudin, quite a number of sideline summits caught the attention of the international media, one of that being, as you mentioned earlier, the summit between Mr. Trump and his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping. Now, Trump gave that particular summit a 12 out of a 10. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are simple. Trump has every reason to be happy about it. He's been able to impose huge tariffs on China. The end agreement says 47%. All Chinese exports, save a few exceptions like fentanyl, will be taxed at 47%. So that's huge. On top of it, the second objective was Trump, is that, you know, the American industry needs these rare earth elements that mostly, almost solely, come from China. China chose not to block these exports. So basically, Trump got everything he wanted. These tariffs are to generate huge revenue, of course, for the American treasury. So that means also the possibility to lower taxes on American taxpayers, as he wants. And last but not least, he was able to put his hand on this Chinese raw material the American tech industry so desperately needs. He has every right to be satisfied.
Right. Professor Gaudin, another highlight of the annual APEC gathering, of course, is the APEC CEO summit. What do you believe were some of the highlights with regard to that particular summit, the APEC CEO summit?
I think it was skilled. It was skilled because, long story short, the strategy of President Lee Jae-myung is to open alternate channels of communication, as the US cannot be as reliable as they used to. So now this parallel summit with CEOs, it is a way to move the debate from political to economic matters. And all of our countries need one another. So that's smart. And more importantly, this specific summit was able to bear significant results. Some sort of agreement is to be expected on AI. Then there has also been significant progress regarding healthcare and the aging issue that all East Asian societies are facing to an extent. So the fact that this economic summit was more fruitful than the official political summit between heads of state, this also may mark some kind of shift in international relations. Korea has been acting relatively noiselessly because all of this was about US and China. And so what Korea has been able to do is to open alternate ways of communication, and they are bearing fruit, which is remarkable. It's been a huge success for Korea, this summit. And of course, it is not something to be bragged about, because it is always best to keep working discreetly. But still, achievements are very real here, very concrete.
How, Professor Gaudin, could perhaps South Korea leverage its successful, if I may, successful hosting of this particular event to perhaps expand its presence on the global stage?
It's a fine line to walk on, because as a middle power, it is always dangerous to expose yourself too much. So here, what Korea is doing is that, on the one hand, you need, obviously, not to offend Trump. That's why it was very smart to offer him the replica of a golden crown, because this is exactly what he wants to be, a king. So it was a very smart PR move on the first hand. But on the other hand, Korea is sharing a lot of common interests with China in terms of denuclearization, but also mostly for trade to go on. The Korean economy, just like China's, is very export dependent. So here, in the case of Korea, the best you can do is not to offend any of both superpowers. And in order to do so, you need to keep business as usual. So that's the best you can do. If you can open new channels of communication, it's for the greater good. But if Korea were to take too much of a self-confident stance, as you can imagine, it wouldn't play so well with President Trump, and eventually it would backfire. So the strategy that President Lee has been following since he was elected a few months ago has been successful, and for the moment, I see no reason to change. It's a very fine line, again, to walk on. So it's an advantage that can only be pushed with the greatest care.
Right. Professor Gaudin, you mentioned China earlier. Now, next year's APEC gathering is to be hosted by China. That being said, what should we be keeping our eyes on, as we wait for that particular event next year?
Well, it will be interesting to watch, at least, because when this meeting is hosted in Korea, that is by a democracy, then it makes it easier for everybody to gather around the table. In the case of China, the question will be, Korea has a lot of interests to share with China economically. But politically, as you know, the Chinese influence strategy can be somehow a bit invasive, to put it mildly. So in the case of Korea, the whole issue will be to find a way to balance these economic interests without, of course, offending Korea's closest ally, which is the US. The fact that the next APEC summit is to take place in Beijing is not necessarily good news because it is to make negotiations more challenging. You can very much imagine, for instance, that Trump is not to go to China expecting nothing else than a landslide victory. So the fact that this kind of summit is hosted either by China or America, it is to make it more tense, I'm afraid. So we need to keep a close eye on it, I'm afraid.
I see. Well, on that cautious note, we'll have to end our talk. Professor Christophe Gaudin from Kookmin University, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.